And I guess the moment when the government lost control of the debate during the week was when Julia Gillard went on 4BC. We'll listen to part of that now and then take it up with the panel.
I'm happy to be judged on what I say, and what I said in the speech was not that. I'm not going to leave undisturbed the impression that I made an announcement about a specific location.
Where will it be then?
How you phrased your question.
Where will it be?
Well, we will have the discussions I've just outlined, and they have started already. In addition, in that...
Yeah, but where will it be?
Well, this will have to emerge from the work with our regional neighbours.
So you don't know?
So, Karen, how did that appear to you? Was it a lack of preparation? In the speech, to be fair, she didn't say that East Timor is the chosen place.
I'm afraid she did give the impression. I mean,
she gave an impression that
the only names she mentioned were the names of the President of East Timor and the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and all the impression that was left was that she was talking about East Timor. The problem was that interview on 4BC. That's where it all came undone. It was a very forensic interview, and I think she was a bit wrong-footed by the tone of it. He interviewed her very well, but he was kind of dismissive of her, and she seemed a bit shocked at that. The interview started off on the mining tax, and she got a bit caught up in some of the detail of it, conflicting suggestions of tax rates, and the interviewer was saying, Michael Smith was saying to her, well, the mining industry said one thing, you said another thing, you lied effectively, didn't you? And she was trying to explain how you could interpret statistics differently and got a bit caught up in that, and then went on to this issue of asylum seekers, and came undone, really, and it was a terrible interview from her point of view.
But then, Jared, the interviewer was demanding to know where this centre was going to be, and that's an unreasonable question, I guess, at this early stage.
Well, there is a tactic now that many interviewers use. You ask one question and then you ask it another 5, 6, 7 or 8 times. If I were the Prime Minister, I wouldn't be doing some of these interviews. Now, I know that John Howard started this up and Kevin Rudd continued it, and now Julia Gillard's doing it, but I don't think it works for any of them. The idea that Prime Ministers have to spend half an hour a day on 1 or 2 occasions in a radio studio answering questions from journalists who just keep asking the same question because they want to score a point. In my view, that's not a good look, and it's not a good idea, and it's not necessary. Bob Hawke had much better sense. He didn't do that much media, and he was much better for it.
Well, John Howard, he mastered that technique of going, I think what he said, over the heads of the Canberra Press Gallery and directly to... He was good at it.
Well, John Howard was good at it.
What's important in doing that is that Prime Ministers get better at selling their messages.
Yeah, but did it really work? I mean, John Howard was good at it. But did it work for him? At the end, the problem with John Howard was everyone was sick of him. They'd seen so much of this. He did too much of it, and particularly in the last 3 years.
But the problem for Julia Gillard was this week that in doing that, I mean, she was seriously having a go. I mean, did anyone really think that she wasn't talking about a processing centre in East Timor? No. And she let that impression run for 2 days' worth of interviews. She did a late-line interview subsequently where all the premise was based around East Timor. So to suddenly say, oh, I never actually said that in the letter of the law, just really, I think, damaged the strength of her kind of pitch to the Australian people that this is a firm plan that she had.
And where this causes a secondary problem, which could be a bigger problem, is one of the reasons that they wanted Julia Gillard to replace Kevin Rudd was, among many, was that there was a sense of chaos. There was so much going on. There were announcements all over the place. It seemed to be all about making announcements and nothing ever brought to conclusion. And part of her brief was to calm everything down and stop this confusion. And what she's done in the last 2 days is create more confusion.
In the past 2 days, and I agree with that, but I wonder, though, further down the track, will you be able to say that she did calm the issue down in terms of it being an explosive election campaign issue?
Potentially, yes. That's the sort of strategic import of what happened this week and why she gave that speech, because Tony Abbott has managed to get enormous traction with this message that if you want to stop the boats, you have to change the government. Now, that was hitting Labor very hard in those outer suburban, regional, rural, conservative seats with with swinging voters particularly. And there are people who had voted for Labor at the last election off the back of work choices who were now looking at this as their defining issue. So that the strategic import of what she was doing this week was trying to neutralise this as an issue for Labor so that they can move to try and talk about other issues where they feel they're on stronger ground.
Yeah, and has she laid the foundation to do precisely that?
Well, it was a fascinating speech because I think in some ways she managed to speak to 2 audiences in the one speech. It was 2 speeches in one, as my colleague Michael Gordon pointed out.
And let's now hear part of that speech, and you say it was 2 speeches in one, and I think this is what you're talking about.
Consider the facts. Last year, Australia received 0.6% of the world's asylum seekers. In the context of our migration program, the number of asylum seekers arriving by boat to Australia is very, very minor. It is less than 1.5% of new migrants. Hard-working Australians who themselves are doing it tough want to know that refugees allowed to settle here are not singled out for special treatment. That people like my own parents, who have worked hard all their lives, the thing that they can't abide is the idea that others might get an inside track to special privileges.
Now, Jared, there are conflicting thoughts there. On the one hand, she's saying, look, the numbers are small, the issue is exaggerated. Nevertheless, I can understand the hysteria.
Well, I think she has to understand the problems that this is causing for the government. A lot of the people criticising Julia Gillard are advocates. Some are even barristers. Many of them have never worked in politics or government more generally. They've never worked for a political party or in the public service. They've never really had to make a decision. These are very difficult times. They were difficult for John Howard. They were difficult for Kevin Rudd. They're difficult for Julia Gillard, but she has to address them, and I thought the speech was moderate in tone. But she had to find some kind of solution because in parts of Sydney, not in the inner city, but in parts of Sydney, parts of Queensland, Western Australia, this is a burning issue, and a Prime Minister cannot ignore it because some people in the inner cities who are barristers or whatever think she should ignore it.
I think that where the problem lay for the government was that Kevin Rudd was ignoring it. He wasn't discussing it. And the frustration was growing in parts of the Labor Party with that approach. Jared is right. This is a simmering issue. It's been going under the radar. It's been email and, people talking, conversations, the water cooler thing. Concern. Whatever you think about the anxiety about this, it is there and they weren't dealing with it. So the primary motivation in that speech was to bring this into the open and discuss it. I think the question you have to ask, and maybe some of the advocates are missing the point here, is she trying to alleviate that concern or is she inflaming it? Now, I would argue that some in the past who've engaged in this debate have inflamed it. I think she's trying to alleviate it, but what you do when you bring this into the open is you run the risk of giving what John Howard used to call oxygen to the people who are trying to inflame it. It's a very difficult debate to manage, and she hasn't entirely managed it all.
Right. Just before you go on, Jared, let's hear from Tony Abbott now and tell me whether you think this inflames the situation as you've been suggesting. Here he is.
People understand that a sovereign country has got to control its borders, and people understand that if anyone can just rock up to Australia and say, I'm here, you've got to keep me, that effectively the country is exposed to a form of peaceful invasion.
Now, he uses that term invasion when, in fact, 1.5% of all immigrants coming into Australia arrive by boat?
It's incredibly small numbers, but I think this is where some of those advocates, again, are kind of missing the debate a bit, that people like Julian Burnside and the Greens are talking about what a small number of people this is. People are anxious about it, small or not, and in some ways you're not connecting with them when you're talking about how many people are arriving in other countries compared to here. The sense of anxiety comes from a perception that there is a lack of order about the migration program. Those words were very carefully chosen by Tony Abbott, peaceful invasion. Now, whether it's a fair sense or not, that's how people are feeling. That's what he's trying to tap into. Julia Gillard is trying to ease the fears, but she's having to bring this issue to the surface, and the risk is that sort of comment will get much more traction.
Well, I'm sympathetic to asylum seekers, and I think when they get in, most of them make very good settlers. They're probably better people to take than people we take from refugee camps in other parts of the world. But governments have to address this issue, and there's a lot of exaggeration around. I mean, people talk well of Malcolm Fraser. In the entire 7 years of the Malcolm Fraser government, only 2,000 people came unauthorised by boats. All the others came through essentially processing centres in places like Galang in Indonesia, in Whitehead in Hong Kong, in the Philippines and some other places. Malcolm Fraser didn't have an open slather policy at all. It was all processed, and all that John Howard was doing, and at times he was too harsh, but not at the end. I think he improved. And what Julia Gillard is doing is proposing an offshore processing which actually worked during the Fraser government.
Why do you say that people who come on boats are better migrants than those who wait in camps?
Because if you come on a boat, or even if you come unlawfully by air, you're very courageous and you've got a lot of initiative and you're pretty bright. And it's a very courageous thing to do, to get on a boat in Java and come in on